Sergeant Marcus Brown loved his job. He was a soldier in the U.S. Army and he wore his uniform with pride. It wasn't just clothes, it showed he was strong, brave, and dedicated to helping others. Marcus had worked hard to get where he was. He went to special schools, trained in tough conditions, and always tried to do the right thing. Marcus wasn't just any soldier, he was a leader. Other soldiers looked up to him and he always tried to be a good example. He knew that being a black man in America sometimes meant facing unfair challenges, but he never let that stop him. He believed in serving his country and protecting everyone, no matter their color or background. He polished his boots until they gleamed, made sure his uniform was always spotless, and practiced his salutes until they were perfect. His family was proud of him and he wanted to make them even prouder. He remembered his grandfather, who had also served in the military, telling him, "Son, wear that uniform with honor. You represent more than just yourself." Marcus took those words to heart. Every day he strived to live up to the ideals his uniform represented: duty, honor, and courage. He believed in justice and fairness, and he hoped that one day everyone would be treated equally. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to do his part. He was Sergeant Marcus Brown and he was ready to serve. One sunny afternoon, Sergeant Brown was driving home after a long day at the base. He was looking forward to seeing his family and relaxing. He was driving the speed limit, listening to some music, and generally enjoying the ride. Suddenly, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was signaling him to pull over. Sergeant Brown carefully steered his car to the side of the road. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and waited for the officer to approach. He made sure to keep his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he had been taught. He knew that sometimes, even in his uniform, he could be seen differently because of his skin color. The officer walked up to his window. "License and registration, please," the officer said gruffly without explaining why he had been pulled over. Sergeant Brown politely asked, "Officer, may I ask why I was stopped?" The officer just repeated, "License and registration." Sergeant Brown calmly reached into his glove compartment to get his documents. He handed them to the officer. The officer looked at them for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Your tail light is out." Sergeant Brown hadn't noticed. He always made sure his car was in good working order. It must have just happened. This was a minor thing, he thought. Usually, officers just give a warning for something like that. But this officer seemed to be looking for something more. The officer didn't just give Sergeant Brown a warning. Instead, he started asking more questions. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice still rough. "I'm coming from my base, sir," Sergeant Brown replied politely. "What do you do there?" "I'm a soldier, sir." Sergeant Brown pointed to his uniform. The officer glanced at it dismissively. "Have you been drinking tonight?" the officer asked, even though Sergeant Brown hadn't shown any signs of impairment. "No, sir, I haven't," Sergeant Brown answered truthfully. The officer then demanded, "Step out of the car." Sergeant Brown felt a knot of worry tighten in his stomach. This was escalating quickly, and he didn't understand why. He carefully opened the door and stepped out, making sure to move slowly and deliberately. He stood tall, showing respect, but inside he felt a growing sense of unease. The officer began to circle him, looking him up and down. "Do you have any weapons on you?" he asked. "No, sir," Sergeant Brown replied. "Are you sure about that?" The officer's tone was challenging, almost accusing. Sergeant Brown's heart began to pound. He knew this was going in the wrong direction. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. He knew he had to remain calm and try to de-escalate the situation, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The officer's questions felt like a trap, and Sergeant Brown was afraid of what might happen next. He just wanted to go home to his family. Without warning, the officer reached out and grabbed Sergeant Brown's arm. "I'm going to search you," he announced. Sergeant Brown was shocked. "Sir, with all due respect, I haven't done anything wrong." "Do you have a reason to search me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't need a reason," the officer said, his grip tightening. "Now turn around." Sergeant Brown reluctantly turned around, his mind racing. He knew his rights, but he also knew that resisting could make the situation even worse. As the officer patted him down, he felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He was a soldier, a leader, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. And here he was, being treated like a common criminal on the side of the road for a broken taillight. The officer found nothing, of course. But instead of apologizing or letting him go, he said, "I'm placing you under arrest for resisting arrest." "But I didn't resist," Sergeant Brown protested, his voice rising in disbelief. "You questioned my authority," the officer said, his face hardening. "That's resisting." He pulled out handcuffs and roughly cuffed Sergeant Brown's hands behind his back. The metal bit into his skin. Sergeant Brown felt helpless and angry. This wasn't right. This wasn't fair. He was being arrested for being black, for being in uniform, for daring to question an officer's actions. As he was led to the police car, he could feel the eyes of passers-by staring at him. Shame burned in his chest. He knew his life was about to change. Sitting in the back of the police car, Sergeant Brown felt a deep wave of shame. He thought about his family, especially his children. What would they think when they found out their father, a soldier, had been arrested? He could imagine the whispers, the stares, the questions they wouldn't know how to answer. He had always tried to be a role model for them, to teach them about honor and integrity. Now he felt like he had failed them. He also worried about his career. An arrest, even a wrongful one, could damage his reputation and jeopardize his future in the army. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and now it could all be taken away because of one officer's prejudice. He wondered if anyone would believe his side of the story. Would they see him as a troublemaker, someone who deserved what happened? More than anything, Sergeant Brown felt a profound sense of injustice. He had sworn to uphold the law, to protect and defend the Constitution. Yet here he was, being treated unfairly by the very people who were supposed to protect him. It felt like a betrayal, a slap in the face to everything he believed in. As the police car pulled into the station, Sergeant Brown closed his eyes, trying to block out the reality of the situation. He knew he had to stay strong, to fight for his rights, but in that moment all he felt was lost and alone. The weight of the injustice pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. He wondered how he would ever explain this to his children, how he would ever make them understand why their father, a good man, had been arrested for nothing at all. At the police station, Sergeant Brown was processed like any other criminal. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and his personal belongings were inventoried. He felt like he was in a bad dream, watching himself from the outside. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was difficult. The humiliation was overwhelming. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he was told he could make one phone call. His heart leaped with a flicker of hope. He knew exactly who he needed to call. His commanding officer, General Hayes. General Hayes was a no-nonsense leader, but he was also known for his fairness and his unwavering support for his soldiers. Sergeant Brown had worked closely with him on several important projects, and he trusted him implicitly. With trembling hands, Sergeant Brown dialed the general's private number. He prayed that he would answer. After a few rings, he heard the general's familiar voice on the other end. "Hayes speaking," the general said crisply. "General, this is Sergeant Marcus Brown," Sergeant Brown said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm calling from the city police station. I've been arrested." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then the general's voice, now filled with concern, boomed through the phone. "Arrested? What happened, Sergeant? Explain yourself." Sergeant Brown quickly recounted the events of the traffic stop, from the broken taillight to the unwarranted search and the false charge of resisting arrest. He tried to remain calm and factual, but he could hear the anger rising in his own voice. When he finished, there was another moment of silence. Then General Hayes spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't worry, Sergeant. I'm on my way, and heads are going to roll." General Hayes didn't waste any time. He immediately contacted the city's mayor and police chief, demanding an explanation for Sergeant Brown's arrest. He made it clear that he would not tolerate any mistreatment of his soldiers, especially not one as blatant as this. He informed them that he was launching a full internal investigation into the incident and expected their full cooperation. Within minutes, the police chief arrived at the station, his face pale with concern. He spoke privately with Sergeant Brown, apologizing profusely for what had happened. He assured Sergeant Brown that he would personally oversee the investigation and ensure that justice was served. He also ordered Sergeant Brown's immediate release. Meanwhile, General Hayes had assembled a team of investigators from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CD. They arrived at the police station ready to conduct a thorough and impartial inquiry. They interviewed Sergeant Brown, the arresting officer, and any witnesses who had seen the incident. The investigators were meticulous in their work. They reviewed the police car's dashcam footage, analyzed the officer's body cam recordings, and examined all the available evidence. It quickly became clear that the officer's account of the events was inconsistent and contradicted by the evidence. The dashcam showed Sergeant Brown being calm and compliant, never resisting the officer's instructions. It also revealed that the officer had escalated the situation unnecessarily, using aggressive language and tactics. The more the investigators dug, the more they uncovered. It seemed like this wasn't an isolated incident. As the investigation continued, the CD team uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior by the arresting officer and several of his colleagues. They found numerous complaints from Black and brown citizens alleging similar instances of harassment, intimidation, and excessive force. Many of these complaints had been dismissed or ignored by the police department's Internal Affairs Division. The investigators also discovered that the arresting officer had a history of making racist remarks and using derogatory language. He had been disciplined in the past for similar behavior, but his punishment had been lenient, allowing him to continue his pattern of abuse. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that the officer and his colleagues had been targeting Black and brown drivers in predominantly minority neighborhoods, using minor traffic violations as a pretext to conduct unwarranted stops and searches. They had been profiling these drivers, assuming they were more likely to be involved in criminal activity. The evidence was overwhelming. It showed a clear pattern of racial bias and abuse of power within the police department. General Hayes was furious. He knew that this wasn't just about one bad apple, it was about a systemic problem that needed to be addressed immediately. He vowed to hold those responsible accountable for their actions and to ensure that such injustices would never happen again. He realized the phone call had opened a door to expose something far bigger and more troubling than just one incident. General Hayes, working closely with the mayor and police chief, who was genuinely appalled by the findings, ensured that swift and decisive action was taken. The arresting officer, along with 3 of his colleagues who were implicated in the pattern of misconduct, were immediately suspended without pay. Following a formal disciplinary hearing, all 4 officers were fired from the police department. Their actions were deemed to be a clear violation of the department's code of conduct and a betrayal of the public trust. The district attorney also announced that he was reviewing the cases of all individuals who had been arrested or charged by these officers with the intention of dismissing any convictions that were based on biased or unlawful practices. In addition to the firings, the police chief implemented a series of reforms aimed at preventing similar incidents from happening in the future. These reforms included mandatory diversity training for all officers, stricter oversight of traffic stops and searches, and a more transparent and accountable system for handling citizen complaints. He also pledged to work closely with community leaders to build trust and improve relations between the police department and the minority community. The message was clear: racial bias and abuse of power would not be tolerated in the city's police department. Those who violated the public trust would be held accountable for their actions, and steps would be taken to ensure that everyone was treated fairly and with respect, regardless of their race or background. The phone call had not only freed Sergeant Brown, but it had also triggered a much-needed reckoning within the police force. With the officers fired and reforms underway, Sergeant Brown's name was finally cleared. All charges against him were dropped, and the city issued a formal apology for the injustice he had suffered. General Hayes personally presented the apology to Sergeant Brown, emphasizing that his service and dedication were deeply valued by the Army. The general also made sure that Sergeant Brown received the support he needed to recover from the ordeal. He was given time off to spend with his family, and he was offered counseling to help him deal with the emotional trauma of the arrest. When Sergeant Brown returned to duty, he was greeted with respect and admiration by his fellow soldiers. They knew what he had gone through, and they were proud of the way he had handled himself. He became a symbol of resilience and courage, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to stand up for what was right. The experience had changed Sergeant Brown, but it had not broken him. It had strengthened his resolve to fight for justice and equality, not just for himself, but for everyone. He continued to serve his country with honor and distinction, knowing that his actions could make a difference in the lives of others. He even began volunteering in the community, mentoring young people and speaking out against discrimination. Sergeant Brown understood that his experience, while painful, had given him a platform to advocate for change. He was determined to use it wisely. Even though Sergeant Brown received an apology and the officers were fired, he knew that this was just one small victory in a much larger battle. He understood that racism and prejudice still existed in many parts of society, and that much more work needed to be done to achieve true equality. He realized that his case had brought attention to the issue of racial profiling, but that many other people, without the support of a high-ranking officer like General Hayes, might not have the same outcome. He thought about all the black and brown men and women who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement, and he felt a responsibility to speak out on their behalf. He started working with civil rights organizations to advocate for police reform and to promote greater understanding and respect between law enforcement and the communities they served. He shared his story at community meetings and conferences, hoping to inspire others to stand up against injustice. Sergeant Brown also became a mentor to young people, encouraging them to pursue their dreams and to never give up hope even when faced with adversity. He taught them about the importance of education, hard work, and perseverance, and he showed them that it was possible to overcome obstacles and achieve success, no matter their background. He knew that changing hearts and minds would take time and effort, but he was committed to doing his part. He believed that by working together, people of all races and backgrounds could create a more just and equitable society for everyone. Sergeant Brown understood that the fight for equality was a marathon, not a sprint, but he was determined to keep running, one step at a time. General Hayes, inspired by Sergeant Brown's resilience and commitment, also took action within the Army. He initiated a series of workshops and training sessions designed to raise awareness about unconscious bias and promote diversity and inclusion within the ranks. He emphasized the importance of treating all soldiers with respect and dignity regardless of their race or background. He also created a confidential reporting system that allowed soldiers to report instances of discrimination or harassment without fear of retaliation. He made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated and that those who engaged in it would be held accountable. General Hayes knew that changing the culture of an organization as large and complex as the Army would not be easy, but he was determined to make it happen. He believed that a diverse and inclusive military was a stronger military and that every soldier deserved the opportunity to serve their country without facing prejudice or discrimination. He often reminded his troops of Sergeant Brown's story, highlighting his courage and integrity as an example of the values they should all strive to uphold. He encouraged them to be allies to one another, to stand up against injustice, and to create a welcoming and supportive environment for everyone. The changes didn't happen overnight, but slowly, steadily, the Army began to transform. Soldiers started to listen to each other more, to understand each other better, and to appreciate the unique perspectives that each individual brought to the table. General Hayes' actions, spurred by Sergeant Brown's experience, created ripples of positive change throughout the military. This story shows us how important it is to speak up when we see something wrong. Sergeant Brown was brave to ask the officer why he was being stopped, even though it was scary. He knew his rights, and he wasn't afraid to stand up for himself, even when he was facing someone with authority. General Hayes also showed great courage. He could have ignored Sergeant Brown's phone call or dismissed his concerns. But instead, he listened, he believed him, and he took action. He used his power and influence to fight for justice, not just for Sergeant Brown, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly by the police. Their actions remind us that each of us has a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. We can all be brave like Sergeant Brown and speak up when we see injustice. We can all be leaders like General Hayes and use our power to make a difference. Even small acts of courage can have a big impact. A simple question, a phone call, a helping hand, these can all be powerful tools for change. When we stand together and support each other, we can overcome even the most difficult challenges. So, let us remember the story of Sergeant Brown and General Hayes. Let us be inspired by their bravery and their commitment to justice. And let us all do our part to create a world where everyone is treated with fairness, respect, and dignity. Because when we stand up for what is right, we make the world a better place for all. Their combined courage transformed not only Sergeant Brown's life, but the lives of countless others. The fight for equal justice is not over. Even though Sergeant Brown's story had a positive outcome, many others continue to face discrimination and unfair treatment. It is up to all of us to keep working towards a world where everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their race, religion, or background. We can do this in many ways. We can support organizations that are working to promote civil rights and fight against injustice. We can speak out against discrimination whenever we see it, whether it's in our schools, our workplaces, or our communities. We can educate ourselves about the history of racism and prejudice so that we can better understand the challenges that people of color continue to face. We can also teach our children about the importance of equality and respect. We can show them how to be allies to others and how to stand up against bullying and discrimination. We can create a home environment where everyone feels valued and respected. Change starts with each of us. By taking small steps every day, we can create a ripple effect that spreads throughout our communities and beyond. we can be the change we want to see in the world. Let us remember the lessons of Sergeant Brown's story and commit ourselves to continuing the fight for equal justice. Let us never give up hope for a better future where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential and live a life of dignity and respect. The journey towards equality requires constant effort, unwavering commitment, and the courage to challenge injustice wherever it exists. Let's all pledge to do our part.